Well, hello everyone. I hope this finds you really well whenever it is that you're watching this and whatever day it is. I want to welcome you to another in our series of webinars for early childhood educators around trauma responsive practice. And today's session is Trauma Responsive Strategies in Action, Part 2. So I am hoping that you have watched Part 1 before watching Part 2, but that's completely up to you. We're going to spend a bit of time looking at strategies in action because I'm really conscious that that's what people are interested in, is how to apply the knowledge around neurobiology of trauma to their practice. It is grounded in an understanding of neurobiology of trauma and its impacts and some of the other concepts and constructs that influence that. And so I suppose I encourage you, if it is that there are terms or concepts that we talk about today that you're not so familiar with, that you should be able to find one of the other webinar sessions to help you with that understanding. So have a look at what's on offer and then select other sessions to view at a different time, just to give you that whole understanding of this way of working. So I want to start, as we do with most sessions, in acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet today, and particularly the Ngunnawal people of Canberra, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and particularly thinking about the wisdom that our traditional custodians bring to raising children, and that we can learn about traditional ways of raising children and helping them to grow up with strength and with wisdom, and how we can apply that in our own practice. So I just want to make that acknowledgement as we start this session today. I also just want to clarify that this is part of a series of webinars that sits within this trauma-informed practice program under the Education Directorate within the ACT. You will know about, I hope, all the other aspects of the program. So that includes access to online self-paced learning, this series of webinars, which will eventually number 25, as well as some discussion papers and blogs that you can read and discuss with your teams and colleagues, and then our professional networks, which you'll certainly hear more about. So as we say, there's several components to the program, so we will keep you posted. Keep an eye out for information about all the elements of this program. So when we start this session, and a lot of the webinar sessions, it may feel like it becomes repetitive if you watch a lot of these webinars, but we really want to focus on what are the key messages of a trauma-informed approach, just to sort of have that consistent understanding about what the content is grounded in. So I just want to take a minute to do that, but equally being conscious that if you have already watched part 1 of this 2-part sort of session, that we went through those messages as well. So I'm going to be even quicker this time. So the first key message is about understanding neurosequential development. So the sequence in which the brain develops helps us to understand what the impacts of trauma might be, because we know that often what trauma does is impacts the lower parts of the brain in that sequence. So the functions of those lower parts of the brain stem, the limbic system, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and that those impacts are often subconscious. And so a lot of the behaviours that we see are not conscious decisions that children are making, because the impact of their experiences has been on their bodies and on the lower parts of the brain. And so neurosequential development helps us to understand that. It also helps us to understand about developmental needs of all the children that we work with and care for. So it's an important aspect of our way of thinking when we're thinking about a trauma-informed approach. The second key message is that repetition builds brains and bodies. Our brains are a representation of the things we've done the most. And again, we'll revisit that in this session, because when we're thinking about the strategies in action, one of the key elements of the strategies that we select is we have to repeat them, and then repeat them and then repeat them, because we need to do that repetition, because that's what helps build new neuronal connections, new brain activity that defines how we all grow, develop and act. So we need to understand that that repetition is really important. The other key thing, which I always feel like people get sick of us talking about, is that relationships are critical. Relationships are vital to our survival. And you know, particularly when we're working with infants, we understand that we have to have relationships with other people as a human infant, because if not, we're not going to survive. So when you think about that reality, it tells you about the importance that our brains and our bodies place on connection, and why we don't do well when we are disconnected. And that's as much for the children that we work with and care for as it is for us as adults, because even though as we become adults, we become more self-sufficient, we still need those connections for our own well-being. So it tells us about how important relationships are, and that we can utilize relationships as a therapeutic tool. So it becomes a tool in our toolkit, not just something on which those tools are grounded. It in and of itself is a tool. So it's just hanging on to that as we think about how we work with the children that we do. The other key message is around trauma, that trauma is overwhelming and threatening. And this is a repetition of what I said in the first part of this session, because it tells us then about what kids need. And what kids need is things that counter overwhelmedness and threat. And so the thing to counter overwhelmedness is containment. So limits, boundary setting, being clear, being consistent is really important. And then clearly, to overcome threat, we need to experience safety. And I think, you know, safety isn't just an absence of threat. Safety is in itself an experience, but it's certainly an important starting point. You want to remove the experience of threat for children to enable them to feel safe. And the key thing there that I sort of underline is feel safe. It's not just about being safe, but about them experiencing that felt sense of safety. So that's critical when we're thinking about our trauma-informed practice. How do I help these kids feel safe in this environment? And then we go back to some of these other points around utilizing relationship, about repeating things, you know, having expectations that are clear and consistent and repeated, understanding that we need to work with actions, not just words, with our understanding of neurosequential development. So it helps to tell us, you know, if this is what trauma is, then this is what children need to counter those experiences. And within that then is these next three things. So safety, as I've just said. Calm is really critical, because calm state is our optimal state. It's where we function best. It's where we learn best, connect best, where our bodies work best, where our brains work best. So we want to understand what calm is and spend a lot of time in that calm state. And to be able to do that, we need to learn how to regulate. And so we start learning regulation through co-regulation. We don't expect babies to regulate their own emotional state. We kind of help them with that. And then gradually we get to the point where we can self-regulate. But as we know as adults, sometimes you get yourself into such a state that you still need co-regulation. I need someone to vent with, you know, that sort of thing, to be able to regulate how I am feeling. And it's a similar thing for the children that we work with. And we know that even just in tantrums, you know, that often kids get themselves so out of control in a tantrum, they need us to help them regulate. So safety is critical, calm is critical, and regulation is critical, and they all connect together. And the final key message about neurobiology, of course, is that behaviour is a story. Children's behaviour tell us what's going on for them. And so our job is to try and understand that story. And sometimes it's telling them that story back to them to help them to understand as well. So they're those key messages that we carry with us through all of the content, you know, hanging on to, okay, how do I understand that? How do I apply that in practice? And that's a lot of what this session is about. So again, in part one, we use this slide as well to talk about some of the key principles of trauma responsive strategies. And what we said was that the strategies are grounded in that understanding of neurobiology and trauma that we just looked at in the key messages, because again, it tells us about what we need to do. The more we understand it, the more we understand how to respond. Equally, the more we understand why things we might have done in the past don't work, because you kind of go, oh, okay, so that's why that doesn't work. And we'll talk about a classic example of that in this session when we look at why, you know, at traditional, what we would call behaviour management strategies, and why they don't work for children who've experienced trauma. So the strategies that we use are grounded in that understanding. The other thing that I've put into bold and italics there is that often trauma responsive strategies are strategies we're already using. And so not to negate that. Sometimes it's really helpful actually because it validates the strategies that we use. It kind of gives us a language for it, because often we would say that the response is instinctual or intuitive. I just thought that was what this child needed at that time, and so I just did it, yeah? And then you kind of think, oh, so that's not really professional if that's what I'm doing, because we're always worried about not being professional, aren't we? So what this can do in understanding trauma responsive practice is then give language and give reasoning to those strategies that we already use, and to be able to say, that's why that works. As much as with the other ones we say, that's why that doesn't work. So it's not about starting again. It's just about revisiting what we do and thinking about why we do it. So then another key principle is around this notion of consistency. So that's consistency from us, and that links back to that concept of repetition. So it's consistency from us as an individual, that I want to be consistent in how I engage in relationship with each child that I work with, for example. But then there's consistency across the centre. So what we want is for everyone to be on the same page, because it's not helpful to the child if everyone's doing something different. So that notion of how do we work as a team across the site or across the centre as a whole is part of the conversation. And that's one of the things we'll also explore a little bit more of in this session. The other thing that we hang on to is about how children and young people are unique. And I know I put young people in there as well, but it's understanding that children are unique, young people are unique, the parents that we work with are unique, the grandparents that we work with, the carers, you know, everyone's story is their own. And it's just saying that sometimes we need to experiment with the strategies that we use, because something will work with one child and it won't work with another. Something will work with one parent, but it won't work with another, because each comes with their own unique story. It's still grounded in the same principles, which is why we keep banging on about principles. And I know I said this in part one, but it's the caveat that I use, because any strategy that I suggest to you, you may come back to me and say, that didn't work, what were you talking about? But it's worked for me with children that I've worked with, but it may not work for you with the children that you work with, because they're unique. So it's the lovely thing about the kids that we sort of care for and educate, but it's the challenging thing when we're implementing trauma responsive practice, because it is a bit of trial and error, and it is that something will work one day and not the next, or with one child and not the next. So we just have to hang on to that. The other thing that we talked about in part one is this notion of a dual focus of providing a therapeutic environment that enables therapeutic change, but that neither of those are therapy. This is not about asking educators to be therapists. This is about asking them to be therapeutic. And really, when we're talking about therapeutic, we're saying we want it to incorporate how we respond to be healing or reparative. We want it to have that concept of caring and healing and repair, repair from the impact of traumatic experiences. So just thinking about the physical environment in which we operate, and then thinking about how is it that we can bring about change for a child that actually does some of the repair of the impacts of what they've experienced. And the lovely thing is, and we'll talk about this also in the layers of action, is the lovely thing about trauma responsive strategies is they're not harmful to children who haven't experienced trauma, because they're grounded in neurobiology, and we all have a brain and we all have a body, so we all sort of share that capacity to engage with that. It's grounded in relationship, so it's never bad to form a relationship with children in an appropriate way, of course. So all of these strategies, they're not harmful. So that's really lovely in and of itself. It has real benefit for kids who've experienced trauma, but it has other benefits for children who haven't. You know, it's just helpful in terms of their development as well. And so that's why we can implement these layers of action, that yes, we might have specific strategies that apply to an individual child, but there are other things that we can do with the whole group, and it's not going to be problematic. And then we can think about how we look after ourselves as a staff team, and then what do we do as a whole site. And then more broadly about how do we work with the whole community in which we operate, because often what we know is that where there's trauma, there's often generational trauma. And so we can be working with the child, but we're also working with the parent who's traumatized, or we're working with a carer who comes with their own history of trauma, or we're working with a grandparent who is caring for their child, perhaps in a kinship care arrangement, whether formal or informal, because their child is unable to care for that child, their grandchild. So thinking about how can we support the broader community, because it has relevance, and these principles again can be applied. How do we provide a consistency of approach for our parent community, for example? Is there a consistent way that we communicate with them? Is there a consistent way that we greet them? Is there a consistent way that we explain what's happening for their child? Do we provide them with play activities as well, because actually they need that experience of play even though they're adults, because it may be something they missed out on in their own childhood. So is there a way we can bring those together? I know I'm jumping ahead, but this is just our way of thinking about the layers of action that are possible, and that have implications and positive outcomes across the child's world. So they're the key principles. The ones that I've put into bold, the dual focus and the layers of action in particular, is what we'll have a look at in this part 2 of our exploration. So let's have a look at the layers. Let's jump straight in. All right, so individual children. How do we work with traumatized kids individually? So we start by understanding that each child is unique. And we also understand that what that then means is we need to do an assessment of need. So I know that often you'll do a range of assessments for children, you know, about their skills, their capacity, their knowledge, you know, where they're at with their writing, or, you know, whatever they're at with their play. But we also want to look at, what does this child need? And thinking about that developmentally. So where are there areas of need? Does this child need to feel safe with other children? Does this child need to feel safe with adults? Does this child need to be provided with a containing space because they feel so overwhelmed by their experience? Does this child need an opportunity to express their emotions in a way that isn't violent? Do they need a way of feeling safe and not having to cover that with aggression or with a shutdown response? Do they need to experience joy in a way that they can tolerate? Do they need to experience praise in a way that they can tolerate? So we really want to understand, what does this child need? Not just what can they do, but what do they need? And so that then tells us about how we respond. And that's how we look at behaviour as well, because we try to look beyond the presentation of the behaviour to the need that sits underneath, because the behaviour is just covering up the need. So the way to do that is just to keep asking, what do I think this child needs? they are being aggressive or they are being violent, what do they need? They need containment. They need to know that they're okay. They need to know that they're safe. And those things then lessen the requirement for them to be aggressive or violent because they actually feel protected. They can trust the adults in the room to look after them so they don't have to start with protecting themselves from everything around them. So how is it then that we can meet that need for them? So then we start to look at safety. So we say there's subcortical experiences to hold the child in their window of tolerance. Now, what the hell does that mean? If this is your first webinar, that's going to be like, oh my God, what is she talking about? That's not English. If it's not, then some of these words will be familiar. So subcortical is about the lower parts of the brain and the body. So sub, underneath the cortex. The cortex is the thinking part of the brain. The lower parts of the brain are the acting parts of the brain. So we need action-based experiences that hold children in their window of tolerance. Now, what's their window of tolerance? Just as a reminder, that's our optimal state of being. So we can either go outside of our window by going into a hyper-aroused response, running, fight, flight, that sort of stuff, or we can go outside of our window of tolerance with a hypo-aroused response, which is a shutdown, withdrawn response. We want to hold kids within their window of tolerance. Some would call that your calm state. Some would call that social engagement state. If you've looked at the webinar around polyvagal theory, then the social engagement state might make more sense to you. But really what we're saying is we want kids to experience safety, and that means calm. So how can we hold them in that? Do we need to, for example, we might use weighted blankets with some children. We know weighted blankets are a tricky one because for some kids, they will feel that sense of being held, which is the need that they have. For other kids, weighted blankets make them feel trapped, and so they'll fight against it. So, you know, it is that, as I say, it's a bit trial and error with each individual child, but it's having ways to enable them to stay within their window of tolerance. And fundamentally, it's those bottom parts of the brain that help us feel safe. The way of connecting with that is to ask yourself about your own childhood and when you felt safe. And what was it that helped you to feel safe? And that doesn't mean that what your experience is what every child's experience is, but it starts to help you understand what that might be, because often it's physiological things. You know, I felt safe when I was held by my dad because he gave me a really big hug and it felt like the safest place in the world. Yeah, people will say that. Or I felt safest when my mum was brushing my hair because it was such a nurturing experience and it was always really lovely and we would talk while we were doing it, but I really loved the sensation of her brushing my hair and then putting it up into plaits, and that was really lovely. That's the physiology of safety. And so we want kids to be able to experience that. Now, we may not hug them and we may not brush their hair, but it's finding ways that they experience that physiological sense of safety that holds them in a calm state and, you know, repels against their need for a protective defensive response, which is where we see the behaviours that we then label as challenging. So I hope that makes sense. Relationship then is really helpful when we're thinking about how we engage. So our blog associated with this project is called Relational Exchange because it reinforces how important that relational exchange between adult and child is, and that every relational exchange is an opportunity for healing and repair. So we often minimize that, but we have to acknowledge that with each individual child, how we treat them, how we engage in relationship with them is a therapeutic tool and a therapeutic opportunity in and of itself. So we might have that unique greeting for each child, you know, about that. We might have a unique name that we call them, that there's a nickname, or that we use their full name, or we use a short name, or, you know, short version of their name, whatever it might be. We might have gestures that we use with particular kids. You know, that some really love high five, some really love that fist bump, some really love an elbow bump in today's COVID environment. There are other kids who just, you know, might like it when you wave at them like that, whereas there's other kids where if you do this to them in the morning, then they think that's the funniest thing ever. So it's finding that way, and then those unique responses to them. You know, that for some, the example I always talk about is if you have a child where you see them escalating and you put your hand on their shoulder, right? For some kids, if you put your hand on their shoulder, that actually settles them down. They find that that is like, oh, okay, someone's there for me. Other kids, if you see them escalating and you put your hand on their shoulder, it just makes them escalate even faster. So it's understanding each child and what they need from that relational sense. And that's grounded in our knowledge of these kids and our relationships with them. So it's just about valuing that and applying that consistently, you know, that's something they come to rely on as a way that you engage with them all the time. It's very little, it doesn't take a lot of time, doesn't take resources, but it's so important when we're thinking about the children that we work with. So then we have regulation. So when we're thinking about, well, how do we support regulation? I might come back to time in. I'm sure people know the concept of time in rather than time out, but I'll talk about it a little bit more later on around some of those responses to behaviour. We might have a taking space card. So where kids need to step away from the group. And clearly when we're working with younger children, they're not going to be able to identify that time themselves. There's no point giving them a card and saying use this when you need to take space, because they can't identify it for themselves. We can identify it for them when you see them starting to do whatever it is that you know, like is it about their, you know, doing this on the table, or is their foot going, or are you seeing their shoulders, you know, starting to go up, and it's like, oh my goodness. And so we might have a taking space card that says, hey, come with me, it's time to go into the, you know, into the calm corner, or let's go outside, or whatever it might be, to try and preempt that. So we want to think about how do we do that. The other thing that we often talk about with regulation is building tolerance to praise, which I think is a really sad concept, but it's something we need to think about, that often these kids carry with them a sense of themselves as worthless and unlovable. And that is such a sad thing to say and articulate. But we need to understand that this is what they carry with them. They can't tell you that, but you might hear it sometimes, like when they're out playing in the sandpit, you might hear them like call themselves a rude word or whatever it is, and you know that that's often because that's what someone has called them, and they've taken that on board in the tone that it's been delivered, not just the word but the tone. What that often means then is that when we, you know, with the best of intentions, we want to make them feel better. So often we'll give them a whole lot of praise, but because of this internal sense of themselves that they can't articulate, when we give them praise, it kind of butts up against it, and they struggle with holding onto that praise. And so you may find kids will reject praise when you give too much of it. So you might say, oh, I really love your painting, like that's fantastic, you know, the way you put the sky up the top and the grass down the bottom and there's a house in the middle, that's so beautiful, I love it, right? And you're trying to, you know, build them up, but what you'll see is they'll go, oh, it's stupid, and they'll start painting over it, or they'll rip it up, or they'll tear it off or something, because they can't tolerate it. So we have to help sometimes the kids build tolerance for praise by just giving them tiny bite-sized pieces to help them tolerate, and eventually we can build that up for them. So it's just understanding that that's why you get the reaction that you do. It's coming from a place of worthlessness, and that we need to help them build tolerance for praise. And as I say, I think that's a horrible expression, but it's kind of understanding what we're trying to do and why we're doing that. And everything that we do, as it says, needs to be repeated. This goes back to this notion of oh my goodness, neuronal connections. That's the word I'm looking for. Sorry, lost it for a moment. Neuronal connections. So the connections within the brain that enable us to do things are built around repetition. So the more often we do something, the easier it is for us to do. And so what we know when we start talking about trauma is that what the kids who've experienced trauma have is brains that have developed through repetition of experience that are really good at surviving trauma. The problem is when they're in a non-traumatizing environment, that doesn't necessarily help them. So we want to provide repeated experiences of positivity that kind of become their default setting rather than the trauma-based setting, if that makes sense. So that's why repetition is really important. And as early childhood educators, you know repetition is important anyway, because that's how kids learn. You can't just do it once and then say, yep, let's tick it off. Like, you guys know that probably better than anyone. So it just becomes doubly important when we're working from a trauma responsive perspective, because we're trying to sort of work against what their past experiences have been. So they're all the ideas that, you know, that we start to think about when we're thinking about working with the individual child. And so then the other one that people always want to know about is, what about behaviour? How do we respond to behaviour? So I think what we say about responding to behaviour is these things. The first is that we want a relational response. So, and we talk about relational primacy, and fundamentally what that means is just putting the relationship first. So what we're saying is that behaviour is not okay if the behaviour is not okay, but you are okay. I'm separating you out from the behaviour. Rather than traditional behaviour management strategies, which don't make that distinction because they assume a relationship between the adult and the child. And so this is where we start to talk about time in rather than time out, right? Time out, you know, that's not okay. You need to go and sit in your room or sit in the corner or sit, you know, in the think about it space or whatever you've done. You need to go and sit there for 5 minutes. Assumes a relationship between the adult and the child, that the child is going, oh, okay, so I really shouldn't have done that. Like, yeah, no, they're not really thinking that, but they kind of get that you're still with them, even though you're not happy with how they've behaved. That's not your experience of the world, then time out is about another adult rejecting you. And all the kid hears is, get away from me, I can't stand you, right? So it's a very different experience for that child. So that's why we use time in, because it says, I'm hanging in there with you, but the behavior needs to have a consequence or an outcome. So the purest version of time in is to say, that behavior is not okay, whatever it is. You need to come and stand next to me for 5 minutes or 2 minutes or 1 minute, however long it is that you have. So, because that still maintains the connection. So it says, I still want to be with you. I'm still connected to you, but I need to tell you that that behavior is not okay. So that's why we talk about time in, not time out. And so it's about saying behavior is not okay, but you are, and I'm hanging in there with you. So other behavior management strategies like counting, you know, I'm going to give you 5 seconds to sort it out, doesn't necessarily work either. Warnings don't work either, because again, they're grounded in an adult-child relationship that is experienced as reciprocal. So the child knows that this adult cares for them. And so, you know, there's that reciprocity of, you know, you make me happy, I want to make you happy. So we're going to muck around, you know, we're going to play that I'm counting to 5, you know, and we get to 4 and then 4 1/4 and then 4 1/2 and 4 5/8 and 4 and whatever. You know, it's all very funny because there's a reciprocity within that fun, and equally there's a sense that this is a relationship where the child is cared for. If that's not your experience, then it's kind of like, well, when's the hammer going to drop? And so, you know, it's more a fear-based response as you get closer to the 5, and it just, you know, it just often escalates the behavior. And the same with warnings. You know, because it's like, well, at some point you're going to say to me that I'm a worthless piece of crap and I need to get away from you. And so, you know, I'll just keep doing it and doing the same behavior over and over again, because at some point you're going to give up on me. So, and that's not a conscious choice. You know, this isn't a child going, oh, well, lady, you can give me 470 warnings. I don't give a stuff, because, you know, they're not thinking that. This is a response because it puts them into that threat state. So we want to reduce the threat. We don't want to say the behavior is okay, though. We still need to give a clear message about what's okay and what's not. It's often one of the misconceptions around trauma responsive practice that we want kids to, you know, we'll let them get away with it because they've had a hard life. That's not helpful to them. I know I talked about this in part 1, but it's really important to have limits to push against, because otherwise when you try and push and there's no boundary or no limit, then you just fall down. So we want to be really clear. So that's the second point, around having clear boundaries, clear expectations, but that when those boundaries are breached, there's a relational response to that. That still gives a clear message: you haven't met the expectation or you've breached the boundary, but I'm still here and I'm still hanging in with you. And so that's where we start to talk about rupture and repair, which again we've talked about previously, but it's just that reminder that, yeah, the relationship is not going to be perfect 100% of the time. There will be ruptures to the connection between me as the adult and you as the child, but what I will always do is come back and repair that with you. Because I will give you a message through my actions, not just my words, that I care for you and I think you're worth it and I'm hanging in there with you. And you can throw all this stuff at me over and over and over again, but I'm still going to be there. And kids who've experienced trauma will throw stuff at you, literally and figuratively, multiple times, because their experience has been that invariably adults do give up on you. And, you know, particularly for kids in care, you know, they've been removed. Often they've had placement breakdowns where, you know, they've been moved from one carer to another. So there's this real sense that my behavior is so, and by extension, I am so awful that people can't tolerate me. And so they send me away. And so what you see is kids continually demonstrating those behaviors because they're going, well, what's the time that you're going to push me away as well? And so again, one of the other sessions that we'll look at is transitions, because that idea about how do we support kids to move from their year with you or their couple of years with you into the next, you know, the next experience of education, how we make those transitions is really important. We know it's important, but it's particularly important for kids who've experienced trauma so that they don't experience it as another abandonment. But that's another session. And then the other thing is around practicing possibilities. And what that's about in terms of responding to behaviour is often kids don't automatically know what's expected of them. They don't automatically know what they're supposed to do because it may be that it hasn't been modelled for them. If my experience of conflict is always that, you know, one person punches the other person because that's the family in which I exist, then how is it that I know that when there's conflict, you don't punch someone? So we have to help kids practice possibilities. What are the options? We also have to help them understand the positive behaviours that they demonstrate, because sometimes they kind of just luck into it. They don't realise that that's kind of what you're supposed to do. So we need to help them understand that. So practice possibilities in the positive, as well as practice possibilities to deal with challenges as well. I usually joke about this as a trainer because I know that most people who come to training hate the idea of role plays, that it's something that makes them want to run a mile and puts them off even going to training in case they have to do role plays. So I try to avoid role plays at all costs. However, role plays are really valuable for kids. So adults, no, of course we don't do them. We're far too grown up for that. But for children, role plays are really important because it actually is helping the brain to understand what they need to do. Not just talk about it, which only goes into the cortex, but actually do it, which then goes into the lower parts of the brain as well. So it's just thinking about practicing, and again, repetition becomes really important. So you can't just do it once and go, oh yeah, we've done that, so they'll know how to do it. It has to be that repeated stuff. And again, I realise you guys know this, so that's preaching to the converted. but this responding to behaviour is a fundamental part of trauma responsive practice. So just some other quick things around working with the individual child. It sits alongside, you know, thinking about neurobiological focus. So some of the impacts of trauma are on memory. So what we want to do is repetition of stories, having visual timetables, having structured days to help kids remember, build that memory for what they're expected to do, what's coming up next. We want to prepare them for what's coming up next as well. Again, we'll talk about that in transitions, because there's transitions during the day as much as those big transitions from year to year. When we're doing an emotional focus, we talked about this quite a bit in part 1. So connecting physiology, what's happening in my body, to a cortical label. But the label doesn't have to be a word. It can be a colour, a piece of music, a texture, whatever. And then we work on regulating the feeling size. Do I want this feeling to be bigger or smaller? How do I let the air out of the feeling? How do I put more air in, is often one of the ways we talk about it. The attentional focus, because often when we talk about kids who've experienced trauma, we often say their focus is on the past, which sounds bizarre for a 3-year-old, but they're really, that survival focus is about them avoiding the experience of the trauma because it's overwhelming and threatening. And so often their attentional focus is quite, you know, small, because it has to be. If you're scared, you know, if you are feeling like you're under threat, what you're going to do is scan the environment all the time to see if there's any threats in the environment, so you can react and respond as you need to. And so that often looks like kids have an attentional issue. I understand that a lot of young kids have attentional issues anyway, but this is kind of on steroids. So we utilise short activities, using breaks, giving kids breaks to be able to breathe and do that regulation, and of course engaging them in things that interest them, because then they can kind of almost let go of that fear and focus on that thing that they love. And so giving those opportunities is really lovely. So yeah, and then the knowledge focus is really thinking about how do we help kids understand their own brains, because it is interesting and kids are interested in it at any age, and it can help them to think about their own responses and what's happening to them. Clearly, we're not going to talk about trauma with the kids, but we can talk about, you know, when you felt scared or when you felt terrified or when you felt happy, because we need to explore the positives as well as the negatives, because often kids struggle with separating out the difference, for example, between excitement and fear, because physiologically they feel very much the same. So kids can struggle with that. So just helping them understand, what are their brains doing? What are their bodies doing? Giving them, you know, language around that can be really helpful as well. So they're all ideas. So I hope that's all right. Sorry, we'll pause and breathe for a moment. Because that's a lot of stuff, but hopefully it's helpful. All right, so if we then look at, okay, well, what do we do with the group as a whole? I think, you know, it's the sort of same but different in a lot of ways. So one of the things that we often talk about is, if we're going to do group activities, sometimes it can be easy to put kids together based on capacity, whereas it can be more helpful to build it around areas of interest, because then everyone's kind of got an equal stake in whatever the discussion is or the exploration is, rather than putting all the kids who are struggling together, because then they struggle together. But whereas if it's something that sparks their interest, then they kind of are on the same footing as another kid who might have, you know, more capacity than they do. So it's just thinking about during the day, are there ways that we can connect kids around areas of interest rather than their social skills capacity, or rather than their, you know, educational capacity. So it's just a way of thinking about that. The other one we look at is the developmental sequence of play, which again, I know we talked about in part 1, about thinking, you know, is this child at that individual play, are they at parallel play, or are they able to engage in cooperative play, start that developmental process? and not necessarily ask too much of them, put them at a stage that they're not at in a group, that it is okay if they're sitting alongside. And again, I know you guys know this, but it's just reinforcing that that's important as much for the general practice of the room as it is, you know, particularly for kids who've experienced trauma. And then we want structured activities. I think that's the big thing for the group, is around having structured activities, particularly linked to regulation. So doing those regulatory activities, which we might call calming activities. So if you want to do drumming or breathing or, you know, kids yoga or whatever it is, that's really helpful, because we know for a lot of kids, unstructured time goes awry very quickly, but particularly for kids who've experienced trauma, that they really struggle with that lack of structure, because again, it can easily lead to them feeling overwhelmed and then threatened. And so they go to those defensive, protective responses, whatever they are, whether they're the fight or flight or whether they're the shutdown, you know, surrender responses. So the more we can structure activities, the better it is. And that focus on regulation and things within the kids' control as well, and that's appropriate control. You know, letting them make a choice between two things is a really lovely way of giving them a sense that it's, you know, the world is within their control in appropriate ways, not in inappropriate ways. And look, there's repetition again, because it's good to repeat, the notion of repetition. But I think, you know, if we want to see positive outcomes, we need it to be repeated. A one-off drumming lesson is lovely and fun, but it's not necessarily going to have a reparative outcome. Whereas if we're doing a drumming lesson on a daily basis or a weekly basis, consistently throughout the term or throughout the year, that's where you might see that helps kids access a different physiological state. The bonus around drumming is that it connects to the brainstem, the lowest part of the brain, and into the body, as well as the diencephalon, that sensory responding. So it builds that rhythm. So if we want kids who are running fast internally to slow down, then utilising that beat that comes from drumming can be really helpful, you know, just to help them get into that space and that physiological state and stay there for a little while. But we need to give them an opportunity to kind of start where they're at and then come down to where they need to be. So that's just one, you know, that, as I say, doing that once would be lovely. But if we can do that consistently, then you'll start to build change in how the child sits physiologically. Some other things that we can look at when we're thinking about the whole group is building that calming environment. So thinking about the therapeutic environment and what works for us. So undertaking a sensory audit is really about saying to the kids, you know, what do you like to see in the room? You know, where do you feel safe in the room? What do you like hearing? Is it nice to hear water running, or is it nice to hear music, or is it nice to hear bells, or, you know, that sort of thing? What do we like to touch? What are the textures that we like in our room? What do we like to smell? You know, is it nice to have sort of smelling stuff that's accessible, or is that yucky? You know, that sort of thing. And whatever I've missed, taste. So, you know, what are the tastes that we like having in the room, and they're there for us. So what works? What helps us feel like we're going slowly, or however you want to language calm? What helps us to feel like that in our room? Do you think over there in that corner that it feels like that, or not really? Because the kids can tell you about what's happening. So having that sort of sensory audit can be a lovely way of doing that. Building in relaxation activities, as we talked about, repeated but reviewed, because it's that balance of, you know, wanting to do things repeatedly, but if they're not working, not flogging a dead horse, like it's that kind of thing. So you want to review, is this actually working? Some of the things that people find useful are the 3M, so meditation, whether that's guided imagery for kids or those sorts of, you know, meditation, breathing activities, mindfulness. So there are a lot of things now around mindfulness for children, and so that can be lovely. And mandalas, just doing, you know, that sort of circle drawing or colouring in can be quite lovely for some kids. Others hate it, but just finding what works and having that accessible. Here we are back at consistency and predictability, also known as repetition, but within that is also preparing kids for change. So if, you know, giving them a warning around, we're going to change activities in 5 minutes, we're going to put the timer on, or we're going to, you know, ring the bell every 30 seconds until it's time to change, not just saying, hey, we need to go inside now. Then there's change of teacher. You know, if you're not there for a day, how do we greet the kids in the morning? Do we bring in someone else that they know, so that then you don't get that sort of reaction to the change? And then clearly articulated and implemented expectations and outcomes rather than rules and consequences. This is what we expect. This is the outcome when it happens. So it kind of links it in, so it becomes a natural consequence. Heaven forbid we use that sort of language. So they're the sorts of things. And again, this is stuff that you're probably already doing. So it's just reviewing it and going, oh, can we do this differently? Could we do it more often? Can we do it better? Or actually we're doing really well and we're seeing the benefit of that. So it's thinking about all of those as we go. And then the final sort of layer is about the whole site. And so it is just taking on the idea that this is a shared community and a shared responsibility. And I get, you know, it depends on how big your site is, your centre is, and how many rooms you have. Because if it's one room, then clearly we're all committed to that. But sometimes it can be that one room or one group ends up with all the kids that have challenges, and then it's like, yeah, that's your problem. But we need to share this across the community and across the, you know, across the staff team. We can't do trauma responsive work alone. We need a team, and that's important to support each other. The other thing, which I know people go, oh my God, she's talking about policies, how boring can you get? How's that linked? Is that you want your policies and procedures to actually reflect what you do. I do have to say that what often happens is that people take on a trauma responsive approach, but what's reflected in the documentation of the organisation or the site doesn't actually reflect what you do, which then makes it hard to embed and be sustainable. So it's really thinking about, okay, do our, you know, does our behaviour response policy, that's the big one, actually reflect what we do? Does our safety policy actually reflect what we do? So it's really thinking about those core things, that are we saying what we say we'll do, and are we doing what we say we'll do? That's what we want it to do. So thinking around a site audit, you know, that's a useful starting point as a team to go, okay, what are we already doing? Because a lot of this stuff you will already be doing. So let's value it, let's name it, let's look at it. Is it that perhaps one room does something but the other room doesn't? And so could we put that into both rooms? How do we do this, you know, outside? How do we do it inside? So thinking about that sort of audit. One of the other webinar sessions will have an audit tool that you might want to use. It's grounded in the practice framework that's outlined in the online training. And so we'll do a webinar session that is looking at using that audit tool. So if you're interested in that, have a look out for that webinar. The other thing is around consistency of language. So you want everyone to be on the same page in terms of how we talk about and to the kids. And then our responses to behaviour. Again, we want this to be consistent. Yes, we want it to be individual and unique, but we want everyone to know how to respond to Johnny, Ginny, you know, whoever it is, so that everyone's on the same page about this is what we do, you know. And it might be these are the words to avoid if you're responding to this child when they're escalating, because that will make them escalate further. These are the gestures to avoid when you're responding to this child who's escalating, because that'll make them escalate further. These are the words to use, or the names to call them, or, you know, the gestures to use. This is what will work, but make sure you don't do these things. So we've got this sort of consistency of response. So then it's not one person's responsibility. We're sharing the load and you know, it's almost doing that tag team thing, like, because as I often say, you'll have days where you go, nah, can't do it, I'm out, you have to take over, please, I cannot respond to this kid again, or I'm going to lose myself, right? So it's about, again, shared community, shared responsibility, even in our responses to behaviour. And that's about looking after the team as a whole. So within the whole site, you want the staff team to be connected. So there are a few things. One is about building a shared understanding. So clearly, if we all understand the neurobiology of trauma, it's easier to implement it, because otherwise you might be going, well, why are we doing this? Looking after yourselves, I can't emphasize it enough. I always talk about it. I annoy people. I talk about it so much, but this is hard. It's hard stuff. You have to look after yourself. It is a neurobiological imperative if you want some science behind it. And again, there's a webinar available around the neurobiology of self-care. So if you're interested, please have a look at that one about taking care of yourself. Because what we want to do is understand the possibility of vicarious trauma, taking on someone else's trauma as if it is your own, and then look at how can we prevent it, because prevention is better than cure. So the more we take care of ourselves, the more we work together, the more likely we are to prevent vicarious trauma from occurring. You want to access external supports effectively, utilising the resources in the environment, external to the site. So making sure you're using what's available, finding out what's available if you're not sure. And I just keep saying, you cannot do this work alone. You need to work as a team, and that's whether you have one traumatized kid or 100 traumatized kids. You can't do this alone. So looking after each other is really fundamental. I know, I'll stop pontificating. But then we look at, okay, so more broadly, how do we, build understanding in the whole community? I think one of the things that we can talk about is about using culture as a resource and a strength, but also about building cultural safety for all of those in our community. How can we utilise that cultural capacity to help all of our community feel safe coming into the centre, but also how can it help us in terms of building resources and strengths that we can use in our work with the kids? How do we link it into some of those trauma responsive practices? Thinking about the principles for all members of our community, that idea about consistency and predictability and relationship and repetition is just as important for the parents often as it is for the children. So thinking about how can we build that into how we connect with our community, sharing information as well. We all have a brain. Neurobiology is really interesting. And so how can we share some of that information with our broader community? That then makes your site, your centre, a safe environment, because again, safety is fundamental. There are often parents or grandparents or carers who don't necessarily feel safe coming into the site or the centre for a range of reasons. Nothing necessarily to do with you or anything that you do. It could be historical, their own trauma, triggers in the environment. So is there a way that we can make this place safe for everyone? And yeah, relational and repetitive comes into our community interactions as much as it does with the children. So it's really mirroring, what we do here is what we do here. It's all the same. And again, it's not going to be harmful if you're not working with a traumatized parent. To be relational is not not going to be harmful for a parent who hasn't experienced trauma. So, but it may make a difference for a parent who has. So it's really just thinking about how can we do that. So then, as always, when we come to the end of these sessions, I ask you, what does this mean for you? What stands out for you as we go through these strategies? Is there a child who's coming to mind? Is there a thing that you do that you're really proud of? What does it mean for you moving forward? And so I just always leave that question for you guys to ponder. You might want to jot down some notes. You might want to chat with a colleague. You might not. You might just want to go home and just have a nice rest rest and watch telly, knock yourselves out. But it's just that opportunity to reflect on what all of this might mean for you moving forward. So I am hoping that this is helpful. There will be other webinars on strategies as well, because we're really aware that that's what everyone's interested in. But this is really starting to unpack the implementation of trauma responsive practice, rather than, you know, just talking about some of the concepts that underpin it. But I hope this is helpful. Good luck. Please access the other elements of the project, and hopefully we'll catch up with you soon. But take care of yourselves, and we will talk soon, I am sure. All right, have a great day. See ya.